Different classes have access to different weapons. If you're a sorcerer, you've probably found staffs, wands, daggers, offhands, and some weird pointy and shooty things that you can't quite figure out how to use. I mean, a sword should be self-explanatory, but somehow, with all of our intelligence, we just aren't smart enough to figure it out. But even with our limited selection of 4 different weapons, what should we be equipping? And this is where the answer gets a little bit complicated, because you might be looking at that staff and going, oh, big damage. Or the wand and say, I feel lucky. Maybe the dagger, pretty good for getting close to enemies and bashing them. And then there's the offhand, which you could use with either the wand or the dagger. Meaning the combinations are staff, wand and offhand, or dagger and offhand. Unfortunately, this class hasn't quite got the dual wield thing down, but who knows, maybe in a future expansion there's going to be a battle mage build where you get to do just that. Or if you want to play battle mage right now, you can play Arclash. I have a full guide on it, which you can watch after this. It's up in the card and down in the description below. But first off, let's start by talking about the staff, because staffs are actually a really good leveling weapon. They have a higher damage range than everything else available. They also have better access to damage stats, such as critical strike damage, lightning crit strike damage, vulnerable damage, and intelligence. But with a higher damage range comes a lower attack speed, which, at low levels, or when you aren't geared, is actually a positive rather than a negative. A lower attack speed means you spend less resources, and a higher damage roll means you're more likely to one-shot a monster. Keep in mind, higher damage and higher DPS are not the same thing. DPS, or damage per second, is a measure of the damage you deal over a unit of time, though a little more about that later. So when you want to hit hard, you are not worried about attacking quickly, and you want big damage stats, a staff is actually the right choice, which isn't necessarily the best for endgame, because as things continue, and as your character progresses, you end up getting a lot of access to damage stats through your paragon boards and glyphs. This not only makes the staff's big upside less impactful, but you also have more access to things that let you manage your mana, meaning that the slower attack speed also isn't necessarily the best. Though a staff does have one other unique upside. The effect of any aspect imprinted on it is doubled. Kind of, sort of. The blue text is doubled, which, generally speaking, means if it's a positive aspect, such as the chain lightning trigger, the values are doubled, and if it's a negative aspect, such as ball lightning deals less damage, the values are halved. Any yellow numbers will not be doubled. They won't be changed at all because yellow text is unmodifiable. Why is this? I don't know. Those are rules Blizzard made, and all I can do is explain them. So overall, a lot of people will use a staff when they're leveling on Sorcerer, but as you get into the endgame, you'll swap off of it. In the endgame, most sorcerers use a main hand and offhand combo, and this is because of stats that can roll on the offhand. Specifically, cooldown recovery, which gives you a higher uptime on defensive skills like teleport and flame shield, because, moving around, stunning enemies, and being invulnerable to damage are all very good things. Or mana cost reduction, because unless you're playing Arclash, you probably have some sort of skill which costs your mana, and costing less means more casts. Also, the faster attack rate of a one-handed weapon means more casts. There are also several other useful stats which can roll on offhands, such as lucky hit or resource generation, and if you want defenses, maybe you're playing hardcore, they can also get damage reduction, or even healing as a lucky hit. So to summarize, most sorcerer builds in the endgame use an offhand either A, to fix their mana, or B, for cooldown recovery to have higher uptime on potent defensive skills. There is of course more nuance to this. For example, Unstable Currents isn't defensive at all, it's just a big old damage boost. Cooldown recovery helps with that. Some builds might actually want to use a staff. For example, if your main skill had a fixed tick rate, and all you really cared about was damage scaling rather than how fast you're putting things out. And if you're, for whatever reason, not relying on lucky hit, something that I don't know if it's even possible for the class, but if you aren't, then the lucky hit implicit is less impactful. Speaking of, the most popular main hand is a wand, because it has a lucky hit implicit. Not only does it have lucky hit as an implicit, but it's made for attacking quickly, which is very good to trigger lucky hits. And if you want to know more about triggering lucky hits, then do check out my Ice Shard Sorc after this. In terms of stats, you get the same kinds of stats on a wand or even a dagger as you would on a staff. So lightning crit strike damage, intelligence, crit strike damage, or vulnerable damage. Those are all highly desirable. There's of course more stats that roll, but a lot of the other things such as damage to close enemies are increases that stack additively rather than multiplicatively. This is also why a wand is so much more desirable than a dagger. The dagger's implicit bonus is just another additive damage, which, while it might be good at low levels, falls off pretty quickly, because, again, you have a ton of that, hundreds of percents from your Paragon board and other gear. So in conclusion, most sorcerer builds will be using a main hand wand and an offhand, at least once you get to the endgame. However, a lot of people on their sorcerer or sorceress are going to be using a staff while leveling, because it's just a little bit more efficient. Now, if you happen to be curious about other sorcerer builds, and maybe you want to see some off-meta ones, do be sure to get subscribed, as I'm going to be doing some build testing and documenting it in future videos. I don't yet know if these builds are going to be successful. Some of them could be terrible, but if it's terrible, I'll still let you know. Personally, I feel like daggers are never going to be best in slot due to having a non-multiplicative damage implicit. I'd love to see if daggers had crit multi, or even vulnerable damage. Something to set them apart where you actually had a reason to use it and it competed with a wand in a meaningful way, instead of, oh hey, here's more damage that you don't actually need as long as you're not level 5. But until that happens, I think we're going to see a lot of people sticking to the weapons like I outlined above. Though I do think that staff is a little bit underexplored. They are powerful, and if you're doing farming strats where you maybe use conjuration skills or have a fixed tick rate, things where it might not be quite as important to proc lucky hit constantly, I do think they offer a fairly large amount of damage, and if that damage is the difference between casting twice and having to kill an enemy that way, or casting once and one-shotting it, it could be just enough. And of course, none of this talks about unique items, which are kind of their own thing. There's unique wand for Incinerate, staff for Fireball, and staff for Charged Bolt. Spoiler alert, 2 out of the 3 items are terrible, and 1 out of 3 I'm still undecided on. If you want to know my thoughts on the various Sorc-specific uniques, then check out my tier list after this video. But I'm curious, if you've been playing Sorc, what weapons did you find yourself gravitating to? Did you grab a staff at low levels because it had a lot of damage, and are you still using it? Or maybe you picked up a wand, realized that Lucky Hit was really good, paired it with an offhand, and you're good to go. And I guess I'm also curious if anyone's using a dagger. I expect it's going to be the least used weapon, as right now it doesn't really offer anything interesting for reasons that I outlined earlier. I think having 4 different weapon types is totally fine, but I'd definitely like to see a little more diversity or reasons to use things. I'd like to see a more equal trade-off. So I'm very curious what future balance changes and Season 1 will bring in that regard. But with that said, a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for their continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. And if you like playing indie games, you can also support me over on Nexus. Both of those links will be down in the description below. Speaking of, there's also a selection of videos that you might want to watch after this. My Arclash Sorc Guide, Ice Shard Sorc Guide, how to fix mana on Ice Shard, why I'm using Blizzard on Ice Shard, and the Sorcerer Unique tier list. You can check out any of those, or the recommendation that's on screen right now. With that said, thanks for watching. Hopefully this answers your question about what weapon to use, and maybe I'll see you again sometime soon.